Hey guys, tonight let's all do the responsible thing and slowly disengage from the modern world. Dim the lights, put your phone face down, pretend tomorrow isn't real yet. You've found your way to a long, meandering historical monologue where nothing urgent happens, everyone is vaguely miserable, and the most powerful people on earth spend their time making deeply questionable life choices. And tonight, we're starting with Cleopatra. Yes, that Cleopatra, the one you're picturing right now, reclining on a gold couch, wearing too much eyeliner, seducing entire empires before breakfast. We're going to gently set that image down, not throw it away, just nudge it off to the side, because the real Cleopatra was stranger, quieter, more anxious, more overworked, and significantly more buried in paperwork than Hollywood would ever admit. And honestly, that makes her way more interesting. So settle in, breathe slowly, and let's drift back to Ptolemaic Egypt, a place where everyone was technically Greek, constantly married their siblings, and trusted absolutely no one. Cleopatra VII Philopator was born in 69 BCE, which already tells us something important. She was Cleopatra VII. This was not a unique name. This was a dynasty that reused names the way some families reuse couches. Her family, the Ptolemies, were Macedonian Greeks who took over Egypt after Alexander the Great died, and everyone immediately started fighting over his stuff. Egypt was not their ancestral homeland. It was more like a very old, very prestigious Airbnb that they refused to leave. For nearly 300 years, the Ptolemies ruled Egypt while stubbornly remaining culturally Greek. They spoke Greek, they married Greek, they read Greek literature, and they mostly ignored the fact that the vast majority of their subjects were Egyptian. Cleopatra would eventually break from that tradition, but we'll get there. Slowly, no rushing. Her father was Ptolemy XII, often nicknamed Ulits, which means the flute player. This was not a compliment. Ptolemy XII was not great. He was deeply unpopular, wildly insecure, and spent enormous amounts of money bribing Rome to let him stay king, which as a strategy works exactly as well as you'd expect. He also had a habit of fleeing Egypt whenever things got stressful, which they frequently did. Cleopatra grew up in a palace environment that was tense, paranoid, and full of relatives who disappeared suddenly. Not violently described, just gone, which was the Ptolemaic version of family conflict resolution. She likely received an excellent education: languages, philosophy, rhetoric, mathematics, astronomy. The Library of Alexandria was still limping along at this point, and while it wasn't at its golden age, it was still the intellectual heart of the Mediterranean. Cleopatra was unusually well educated, even by royal standards. She spoke multiple languages fluently, including Egyptian, which was a big deal. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler to bother learning it. This wasn't a quirky hobby, it was political. Cleopatra understood something her ancestors hadn't. If you want people to stop hating you, it helps to speak their language and acknowledge their gods exist. Already we're drifting away from the myth. This is not a woman floating through life on vibes alone. This is a strategic thinker who grew up watching her family sabotage itself repeatedly. When Cleopatra was around 18, her father died, and as was traditional, the throne did not pass cleanly to one person. Instead, Cleopatra was forced to co-rule with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. He was about 10 years old. And yes, they were married. This was normal. It was gross, but normal for the dynasty. The Ptolemies believed sibling marriage preserved divine bloodlines. What it actually preserved was a long legacy of medical issues and personality disorders. Ptolemy XIII was a child king, controlled by a group of male advisors who did not like Cleopatra. They found her threatening. She was older, she was competent, she was not interested in being quiet. So naturally, they pushed her out. Within a year or two of her reign, Cleopatra was exiled. She fled to Syria, where she began raising an army. Not dramatically, just practically. And this is where Rome enters the story, dragging chaos behind it like a loose sandal. At this point, Rome was already deeply involved in Egyptian politics. Egypt was rich, strategically vital, and politically unstable, which made it irresistible. Enter Julius Caesar, tired, overworked, fresh from a civil war. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria, he walked straight into a sibling power struggle that no one had bothered to resolve. Ptolemy XIII's people thought he could impress him by murdering Caesar's rival, Pompey, and presenting his head as a gift. Caesar was not impressed. Cleopatra saw an opportunity, and this is where the famous carpet story appears. According to later sources, Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters wrapped in a carpet or a sack. This story has been exaggerated, dramatized, and turned into a personality trait. Was she physically rolled up? Maybe. Was it probably just a discreet entrance arranged by allies? Also maybe. What matters is not the method, it's the timing. Cleopatra met Caesar privately, argued her case, and convinced him she was the better ruler for Egypt. This was not seduction in the modern sense. This was politics. Caesar backed her claim. This led to a short, messy conflict in Alexandria. Buildings burned, people panicked, and eventually Ptolemy XIII drowned while fleeing. Cleopatra became queen again, this time ruling alongside another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, because apparently the dynasty had not learned anything. She later had a son with Caesar, Ptolemy XV, better known as Caesarion. Whether Caesar officially acknowledged him remains unclear, but Cleopatra absolutely did. She traveled to Rome. She stayed in Caesar's villa. She caused scandals simply by existing too confidently in public. Roman elites did not like her, not because she was immoral, but because she was foreign, powerful, and impossible to ignore. Then Caesar was assassinated, which, as usual, changed everything. Cleopatra returned to Egypt. Ptolemy XIV died soon after, suspiciously, but we'll keep our tone neutral and sleepy. Cleopatra ruled alone with Caesarion as her co-ruler, and she ruled well. She stabilized Egypt's economy, she managed grain supplies, she navigated Roman politics carefully. She presented herself as the living embodiment of Isis, blending Greek and Egyptian traditions into a single cohesive image. This wasn't vanity, it was branding. Then came Mark Antony. Antony has been turned into a romantic lead in popular culture. In reality, he was charming, impulsive, and chronically irresponsible. He drank too much. He loved spectacle. He avoided paperwork whenever possible. Cleopatra understood him immediately. Their relationship was political, personal, and mutually beneficial. They were allies, they were lovers, they were both trying to survive a world being carved up by Rome. Together they had children, they staged elaborate ceremonies, they annoyed Octavian, which in retrospect was not the best long-term strategy. Octavian, later Augustus, was patient, cold, and very good at propaganda. He painted Cleopatra as a dangerous Eastern seductress corrupting a noble Roman man. This narrative stuck. It has never really gone away. War followed. Actium happened. Antony lost. Cleopatra lost. And here's where the myth tightens its grip. Cleopatra's death has been endlessly dramatized. The asp, the dramatic pose, the theatrical timing. In reality, we don't know exactly how she died. Poison is just as likely. What we do know is that she chose death over being paraded through Rome as a trophy. That choice was rational, it was controlled, it was very much in character. Cleopatra was 39 years old, not ancient, not reckless, not a cartoon. She was a multilingual ruler, a political strategist, a survivor of a deeply dysfunctional dynasty, and a woman who understood power better than most of her contemporaries. But history remembered her eyeline, and that's where we'll pause for now. Let the story settle around the edges. Let the myths soften around the edges. In the next part, we'll drift outward from Cleopatra herself and into the broad... All right, let's ease back in. If you drifted off a little during part 1, that's perfect. That's the ideal outcome here. History should feel like background rain. When we left off, Cleopatra was gone, Egypt was doomed to become a Roman province, and Octavian was already workshopping his victory speech. And this is where Cleopatra's second life begins, not the real one, the historical afterlife, which is somehow messier. Because once Cleopatra was safely dead, Rome could finally relax and decide who she had been supposed to be. And Rome, as always, chose the pettiest possible option. Octavian needed a villain, not a complicated geopolitical situation, not Roman overreach, not his own ambition. He needed a woman, preferably a foreign one. So Cleopatra became the embodiment of everything Rome pretended to fear: luxury, excess, emotion, Eastern decadence. She was framed as a temptress who had bewitched Antony, drained him of his Roman virtue, and lured him away from his duties with silk cushions and scented baths. Which is funny because Antony had been dodging responsibility long before Cleopatra ever met him. But propaganda doesn't care about timelines. It cares about vibes. Octavian presented himself as the defender of Roman values against an exotic queen who wanted to enslave Rome through seduction. This narrative was incredibly effective. It also wasn't true. Cleopatra never invaded Rome. She never marched armies west. She didn't need to. Her entire strategy was about preserving Egypt's autonomy through alliance, not conquest. But that version of events is boring, and boring never survives. Roman poets, historians, and later writers leaned into the fantasy. Cleopatra was rewritten as a siren, a witch, a manipulator. Her intelligence was reframed as trickery. Her political skill became seduction. Her confidence became arrogance. And most importantly, her actual accomplishments were gently ignored. No one lingered on her economic reforms. No one admired her linguistic ability. No one cared that she governed one of the most complex states in the ancient world during a period of extreme instability. Instead, we got eyeliner, and snakes, and couches. This wasn't accidental. It was instructional. Roman writers used Cleopatra as a warning story, a reminder of what happens when men lose control, and also, coincidentally, what happens when women gain too much. And here's where things get interestingly repetitive. Because Cleopatra was not unique, she just became the most famous example of a pattern that would repeat for centuries. Powerful women get flattened into archetypes: seductress, madwoman, monster. And the more competent they were in life, the more exaggerated their flaws become in death. Cleopatra's story became a template. Let's float gently for a moment into the question everyone asks eventually. What did Cleopatra actually look like? And the answer is deeply unsatisfying. We don't know. Coin from her reign show a woman with a strong nose, sharp chin, and practical hairstyle. Not exactly a goddess carved from marble, but also, coins are propaganda too. They were designed to convey authority, not attractiveness. Male rulers weren't depicted as heartthrobs either. They were depicted as powerful. Later writers became obsessed with the idea that Cleopatra must have been irresistibly beautiful, because how else could they explain her influence? The idea that she was persuasive, educated, and politically astute was somehow less believable. So beauty became the explanation, because it was simpler and lazier. Plutarch, writing long after her death, famously said that her beauty was not extraordinary, but her charm was overwhelming, which is probably the closest we'll ever get to the truth. Cleopatra was likely compelling, engaging, quick-witted. She understood people, and she understood presentation. That doesn't translate well into sculpture, so later generations filled in the gaps with fantasy. And then came the Renaissance, which was a great time for art and a terrible time for historical nuance. Painters rediscovered classical themes and immediately went all in on Cleopatra as a symbol of erotic tragedy. Bare skin, dramatic poses, very committed snakes. These images had almost nothing to do with the historical queen. They were moral lessons disguised as art. Cleopatra was used to represent the dangers of lust, the fall of reason, the punishment of excess. She became less a person and more a decorative warning label. And then came theater. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra sealed her fate in popular imagination. His Cleopatra is brilliant, dramatic, volatile, seductive, playful, and self-destructive. She is mesmerizing. She is exhausting. And she is not history. But she is memorable, which is the real currency of legacy. From there, Cleopatra became a permanent resident of Western culture. Every era remade her in its own image. The Victorians turned her into a moral lesson. Early Hollywood turned her into a spectacle. Elizabeth Taylor turned her into an event. Each version said more about the time it was created than about Cleopatra. All right, let's sink back in. If your thoughts are already drifting, you're exactly where you should be. Cleopatra is technically dead now, but history is about to keep talking about her anyway. Relentlessly, for 2,000 years. Because Cleopatra didn't just lose a war, she lost control of her narrative. And Rome absolutely loved that part. After Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, Octavian did what Rome always did best. He tidied things up. Egypt became his personal possession, not a province, a private estate. The grain flowed, the gold flowed, Rome exhaled. Octavian returned to Rome and became Augustus, first emperor, founder of the system that would quietly run the ancient world for centuries. And Cleopatra? Cleopatra became a warning label. Roman poets, historians, and moralizers got to work immediately, because nothing cements a new regime like a good villain. Cleopatra was rewritten, flattened, simplified. She was no longer a multilingual ruler balancing diplomacy and survival. She was a temptress, a foreign queen who used sex instead of strategy, a woman who enslaved Roman men, a symbol of excess, luxury, and moral decay. This was useful. If Antony lost because Cleopatra was irresistible, then Rome lost to weakness, which could be corrected. If Cleopatra was a monster, then Augustus was a savior. So the story stuck. Plutarch wrote about her charm, but emphasized that it wasn't her beauty, which sounds complimentary, but actually wasn't. It framed her as manipulative, dangerous. Horace called her a fatal monster, which is not subtle. Roman art portrayed her as exotic, Eastern, other. She became less a person and more a concept. And that concept was uncomfortable. Because Cleopatra didn't behave the way Roman women were supposed to behave. She ruled, she spoke publicly, she negotiated, she commanded loyalty. So Rome explained her away. For centuries, that version dominated. Medieval writers inherited it uncritically. Renaissance artists added drama. Baroque painters added nudity. Victorian moralists added judgment. By the time Hollywood arrived, Cleopatra was no longer human. She was a vibe, and not a quiet one. But here's the sleepy, inconvenient truth. Cleopatra wasn't unusually cruel. She wasn't unusually decadent. She wasn't unusually manipulative. She was just unusually visible. She ruled for 21 years. That alone should tell us something. Her economy functioned, her administration held together, her people didn't revolt constantly, which in ancient terms is impressive. She aligned Egypt with Rome as long as alignment was possible, and when it wasn't, she lost. Not because she was reckless, but because Rome had more ships, more men, and more patience. Cleopatra didn't ruin Antony. Antony made his own choices. Cleopatra didn't hypnotize Caesar. Caesar recognized a capable ally. Cleopatra didn't doom Egypt with decadence. Egypt was already cornered by empire. But none of that makes for a catchy moral lesson, so history chose the easier version. And then came the modern obsession with her appearance. Was she beautiful? Was she ugly? Was she average? Coins show a strong nose, a sharp chin, distinct features, which has launched centuries of arguments that somehow miss the point entirely. Cleopatra lived in a world where beauty was performative, costume, symbol, presence. She controlled how she appeared, how she entered rooms, how she was remembered, until Rome took over. The fixation on her looks is another way of reducing her, turning a ruler into a face, and it's exhausting. Cleopatra's legacy is not that she was seductive, it's that she was competent in a system designed to erase her. She understood propaganda because she lived inside it. She understood power because she watched it collapse repeatedly. She didn't invent spectacle, she used it. She didn't claim divinity because she believed she was a goddess. She did it because Egypt understood rulers that way. Cleopatra was pragmatic, adaptable, and painfully realistic, which is why her ending feels so controlled. Her ending wasn't dramatic, it was final. No bargaining, no begging, just a refusal to be paraded. And Rome respected that, reluctantly. Augustus allowed her to be buried with Antony, a small concession, a quiet acknowledgement. Then he moved on, and Cleopatra drifted into legend. So when we talk about Cleopatra today, we're not really talking about her. We're talking about how power responds to women who refuse to be small. We're talking about how history smooths out complexity until only stereotypes remain. Cleopatra wasn't perfect. She was ruthless when she needed to be. She played dangerous games. She lost. But she also ruled intelligently in a collapsing world. And honestly, that's enough. So let's leave her here. Not frozen in marble, not dripping in gold. Just a woman at the edge of empire, doing what she could with what she had. Let the Nile flow quietly. Let Rome fade into the background. And if you're drifting off now, that's exactly how Cleopatra would want it. Unbothered, unreachable, still talked about. All right, if you're still with me, fantastic. If you're half asleep and only catching every third sentence, even better. Because part 4 is where Cleopatra stops being a person entirely and becomes a historical screensaver. Always there, always glowing faintly, never doing much. After Rome finished packaging Cleopatra as a moral lesson, the story didn't stop. It just slowed down, stretched out over centuries, picked up new accessories. Medieval writers didn't know what to do with Cleopatra. She was pagan, foreign, female, which meant she mostly existed as a vague, cautionary tale about lust and pride. She drifted through medieval texts like a rumor, a queen who seduced men, a woman whose beauty caused empires to wobble. No one was particularly interested in her policies or her administration, or how she actually governed, because that would require admitting she governed at all. Instead, Cleopatra became symbolic, and symbols are very low maintenance. By the Renaissance, things got louder. Artists rediscovered the classical world and immediately decided Cleopatra should be naked. This was non-negotiable. Paintings of the death of Cleopatra exploded across Europe. Snake, breasts, dramatic drapery. Accuracy was not the goal. Vibes were the goal. The snake, by the way, became fixed in this period, despite the fact that ancient sources were unclear and sometimes contradictory. A snake is visually interesting. Poison is not. So the snake stayed. Renaissance writers also leaned hard into the romance. Cleopatra and Antony became tragic lovers. Less politics, more feelings. Shakespeare sealed the deal. His Cleopatra is brilliant, witty, volatile, but also intentionally theatrical. She is meant to be watched, judged, admired from a distance. She is not meant to be understood as a ruler managing grain supply. And that version stuck. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Cleopatra was officially exotic. Orientalist fantasies took over. She lounged on couches, she wore increasingly imaginary outfits, she existed to be gazed at. Victorian writers clutched their pearls, Victorian painters quietly did not. Cleopatra was framed as dangerous because she enjoyed luxury, which is fascinating considering she was a monarch. Luxury was literally her job. But the narrative required punishment. So Cleopatra was indulgent, decadent, excessive. Rome, meanwhile, remained disciplined and masculine, even though it absolutely wasn't. Then came the 20th century and Hollywood, and Cleopatra became enormous. Silent films turned her into spectacle. Big sets, big costumes, big eyeliner. Then Elizabeth Taylor arrived in 1963, and that was it. The film nearly bankrupted the studio, the costumes weighed a metric ton, the drama behind the scenes overshadowed the actual history, which is, honestly, very on brand. Taylor's Cleopatra was glamorous, commanding, and impossibly beautiful. She was also deeply divorced from the historical figure. But by then, accuracy didn't matter. Cleopatra was pop culture, and pop culture doesn't do nuance. At the same time, historians quietly kept working. Coins, papyri, inscriptions. A different Cleopatra began to emerge. Less dramatic, more administrative. She issued decrees, managed famine, controlled currency. Not exciting things, but important ones. And this is where the truth versus myth tension really settles in. The myth wants Cleopatra to be extraordinary in the wrong ways. Beautiful, dangerous, uncontrollable. The truth suggests she was extraordinary in boring ways. Competent, educated, politically fluent, which is somehow less marketable. Modern debates about Cleopatra's ethnicity added another layer. She became a battleground for identity arguments. Greek, Egyptian, African. The evidence tells us she was ethnically Greek, culturally Egyptian, and politically Mediterranean, which is not a neat box, so people keep trying to shove her into one anyway. Cleopatra herself would likely find this exhausting. She understood identity as performance, as language, as presentation. She ruled Egypt by presenting herself as Egyptian. She dealt with Rome by understanding Roman psychology. She was flexible. That was her strength. But flexibility doesn't survive well in myth. Myth wants absolutes. So Cleopatra becomes either a genius or a seducer, a feminist icon or a villain, a symbol of empowerment or downfall. The truth, as usual, is quieter. Cleopatra was a monarch born into a declining dynasty. She inherited problems she did not create. She delayed collapse longer than most. She lost not because she was foolish, but because Rome was inevitable. And inevitability is deeply unsatisfying. People prefer personal failure, personal weakness, personal seduction. It feels cleaner. So Cleopatra gets blamed. And yet, 2,000 years later, she's still here, still discussed, still argued over. Her enemies are footnotes. Her victors are remembered for defeating her. That alone says something. Cleopatra didn't leave behind monuments the way pharaohs did. She left behind a question. What happens when a woman refuses to be forgettable? History still doesn't have a comfortable answer, so it keeps telling the story, again and again, softly reshaping it each time. And now, as we ease toward the end of our long, drifting Cleopatra evening, it's okay to let the myth and the truth blur just a little. Not because accuracy doesn't matter, but because the real Cleopatra lived in that blur, between cultures, between empires, between narratives she controlled and narratives she didn't. And maybe that's why she's still interesting. Not because she was perfect, not because she was seductive, but because she was unfinished. So let's let her rest. Still debated, still misinterpreted, still undefeated in memory. And if you're asleep by now, she's absolutely won. All right. This is the part where everything softens, where the edges blur, where Cleopatra stops being debated so loudly and just lingers. If you're drifting in and out now, that's perfect. This part doesn't need full attention. Cleopatra has already had enough of that. After all the myths, after the paintings and plays and films and arguments, after everyone finished projecting whatever they needed onto her face, what's left is something calmer. Cleopatra didn't leave behind a manifesto. She didn't write a memoir. She didn't get to explain herself in her own words, which means her legacy is mostly made of echoes. But echoes matter. Because even stripped of romance and scandal, Cleopatra represents something deeply uncomfortable for history. She was a woman who ruled without apology, not as a regent, not as a placeholder, not as someone waiting politely to be replaced. She ruled fully. She issued orders, she negotiated treaties, she controlled one of the most important economies in the ancient world, and she did it while Rome was circling like a bored cat. That alone is impressive, but it's not flashy, so it doesn't get talked about much. Instead, we get endless discussions about whether she was pretty, whether she was manipulative, whether she was responsible for Antony's feelings, which says more about us than about her. Cleopatra didn't invent the idea of female power being threatening. She just lived inside it very visibly, and visibility has consequences. Most male rulers of her era could fail upward. They could lose battles, drink too much, make disastrous alliances. History would shrug. Cleopatra did not get that luxury. Every mistake became moral. Every choice became personal. Every alliance became seduction. It's exhausting just thinking about it. But Cleopatra seemed to understand this. She never pretended the rules were fair. She just learned how to move within them. She used ceremony. She used spectacle. She used lineage. She used language. Not because she was shallow, but because she was practical. Power responds to performance. Always has. Cleopatra didn't confuse performance with reality. She used it as a tool. That's a subtle distinction, and subtlety rarely survives conquest. So Rome flattened her. turned her into a lesson, a warning, a story about what happens when women get too much influence. And yet, Rome fell. Not quickly, not dramatically, but inevitably. Egypt became a province, then a battleground, then something else entirely. Cleopatra's world vanished, but her name didn't. Which is strange when you think about it. So many emperors ruled longer, won more battles, built more monuments. And yet, here we are, still whispering Cleopatra's name before sleep, still trying to figure out who she really was. Maybe that's her final victory. She didn't get to choose how she was remembered, but she refused to be forgotten. Cleopatra exists in the spaces between certainty, between admiration and discomfort, between myth and document. She never fully belongs to anyone. Not Rome, not Egypt, not Hollywood. She slips out of every box eventually, and that might be the most accurate thing about her. So as we settle into the quiet now, it's okay to let go of conclusions. Cleopatra doesn't need a verdict. She doesn't need to be defended or condemned. She already did the hardest part. She lived. She ruled. She endured longer than expected. And when the end came, she chose it herself. History can argue forever about what that means. Cleopatra, meanwhile, rests. Somewhere beyond the myths, beyond the marble, beyond the endless eyeliner debates. Just a woman who once held an empire together with intelligence, nerve, and timing, and then disappeared into legend. So let the noise fade. Let the arguments quiet down. And if sleep takes you here, that's probably exactly where Cleopatra would prefer to be remembered. Not loudly, not perfectly, just still here. All right, we're still here. Still drifting, still circling Cleopatra long after she's gone, because history never quite knows when to stop talking. By now, Cleopatra herself has faded into that soft historical haze, but her children haven't. Not yet. And Rome, as always, has opinions. Let's start with Caesarion, the child who caused Rome a mild but persistent headache. Ptolemy 15 Caesarion was Cleopatra's son with Julius Caesar. At least Cleopatra said so. Caesar never officially confirmed it, which was convenient. Caesarion grew up in Alexandria, styled as a king, a god, and the rightful heir of a murdered dictator. That's a lot to carry before puberty. For Cleopatra, Caesarion was everything. Proof of legitimacy, a living political argument. For Octavian, Caesarion was a problem, because Rome does not enjoy loose ends. After Cleopatra's death, Caesarion was briefly declared pharaoh, a symbolic gesture, one last assertion of continuity. It didn't last. Octavian had him captured and executed. He was around 17. No spectacle, no drama, just removal, because Rome does not tolerate alternative heirs. And that was that. Cleopatra's other children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, were spared, not out of mercy, but because they were useful. They were brought to Rome, paraded in Octavian's triumph, which is a strange way to start a childhood. Gold chains, foreign crowds, their mother's defeat turned into a parade float. Eventually, they were raised by Octavia. Yes, the same Octavia Antony married and quietly humiliated. History has a sense of irony it uses sparingly, but effectively. Cleopatra Selene, the daughter, is the one who matters most here, because she survived. She married Juba II of Mauritania, another client king, another Roman-approved ruler. Together, they ruled a quiet, intellectual court. They sponsored art, learning, culture. Cleopatra Selene named her son Ptolemy, because traditions die hard. She filled her kingdom with symbols of her mother's Egypt, Isis imagery, Alexandrian aesthetics, a soft echo, nothing Rome needed to worry about. And that's how Cleopatra's line ended, not with rebellion, not with revenge, but with absorption. Rome didn't erase Cleopatra's children, it repackaged them. That's important. Rome rarely destroyed outright when it could assimilate instead. Which brings us to the bigger, quieter aftermath. Egypt under Rome became stable, profitable, controlled. No more divine queens, no more theatrical entrances. Just governors, taxes, grain shipments. Efficient, full. Exactly how Rome liked it. Cleopatra would not have thrived in this world. She was too visible, too symbolic. Rome preferred its power invisible, administrative, boring. And that's how Cleopatra slipped into legend instead of policy. Roman writers continue to reference her for centuries, always as contrast. She became shorthand for excess, for luxury, for danger. Whenever Rome wanted to remind itself how disciplined it was, Cleopatra showed up as the example of what not to be. This is deeply ironic given how Roman emperors actually behaved, but irony doesn't bother history much. Cleopatra became less a memory and more a tool, and over time, even that softened. By the late Roman Empire, Cleopatra was no longer threatening. She was distant, almost decorative, a story from a different age, which is usually the moment when figures start becoming interesting again, because once the danger fades, curiosity returns. People start asking quieter questions. Was she really that dangerous? Was she really that powerful? Was she really that different? And slowly, scholarship peeled away the exaggeration. Not dramatically, not loudly, just piece by piece. Coins studied, documents translated, assumptions questioned. And Cleopatra re-emerged. Not glamorous, not monstrous, just human, which is oddly more unsettling than the myth. A woman making rational choices in an irrational system, a ruler adapting until adaptation was no longer enough. No curses, no destiny, just pressure. So if Cleopatra feels oddly modern sometimes, that's why. She lived in a collapsing world. She navigated propaganda. She balanced public image with private survival. She understood that power was fragile and temporary, which is a lesson history keeps relearning. And now, as we drift further from her time, Cleopatra stops being a warning and starts being a mirror. What do we do with women who don't fit the story we want? How do we talk about power without turning it into spectacle? History hasn't figured that out yet, so Cleopatra stays useful and quiet. So let's leave her children where Rome left them, integrated, contained, mostly forgotten, and let Cleopatra herself remain where she always seems to end up, not ruling, not seducing, just hovering at the edge of the story, refusing to disappear completely. All right. At this point, we're deep into the soft hours, the part of the night where thoughts loop gently and history starts feeling less like a timeline and more like a familiar voice you've heard too many times to count. Cleopatra has been dead for a while now. Her children are folded neatly into Rome. Her kingdom is reorganized, taxed, and shipped out in grain form. And yet, we're still here, talking about her. Because Cleopatra didn't just become history, she became a habit. Every generation finds its own Cleopatra, not because the evidence changes dramatically, but because the questions do. The ancient Romans asked, how did this happen to us? The Renaissance asked, how dramatic can we make this? The Victorians asked, how scandalous is too scandalous? The modern world asked, what does she mean now? And that's where things get repetitive, in a very soothing way. Cleopatra becomes whatever the moment needs: a feminist icon, a cautionary tale, a racial symbol, a political metaphor, sometimes all at once. Which is unfair, but also unavoidable. Cleopatra left behind just enough evidence to anchor her in reality and just enough silence to let imagination run wild. That's the perfect ratio for immortality. If we knew everything about her, she'd be boring. If we knew nothing, she'd be forgettable. Instead, she sits right in the middle, and historians keep circling her carefully. Modern scholarship has tried very hard to calm things down, to strip away the drama, to talk about taxation policies and temple endowments, but the public rarely stays awake for that part. So Cleopatra slips back into spectacle, again and again. And maybe that's not entirely a failure, because even the spectacle points to something real. Cleopatra unsettles people, still, not because she was seductive, but because she refuses to be simple. She doesn't fit cleanly into hero or villain. She doesn't sit comfortably in national narratives. She doesn't behave the way history prefers its women to behave. She ruled too long, she spoke too many languages, she aligned with power instead of hiding from it. And she didn't apologize. That last part lingers. Cleopatra didn't leave letters explaining herself. She didn't justify her ambition. She didn't ask to be understood. She assumed her actions would speak for themselves. Rome disagreed and rewrote her anyway, which raises a quiet, uncomfortable question. How many other Cleopatras never made it into the record at all? How many rulers were reduced to caricatures because it was easier than engaging with their competence? Cleopatra survived that reduction only because she was impossible to ignore. She stood at the intersection of empire, gender, and spectacle, a very noisy place to stand. Most people never get that chance. And that's why she endures, not because she was unique in every way, but because she was uniquely visible. Cleopatra didn't invent the problems she faced, she just faced them on a very large stage, and history never stops replaying the footage. Even now, documentaries argue about her face, films argue about her casting, articles argue about her identity, all of it orbiting the same quiet truth. Cleopatra was powerful, and power makes people uncomfortable, especially when it's worn confidently. So they decorate it, soften it, turn it into something safer, a love story, a scandal, a tragedy, anything but a ruler doing her job. Because that version forces harder questions, and those questions don't lull you to sleep quite as easily. But if you listen closely, beneath the noise, Cleopatra's story is actually very calm. A woman inherits a fragile kingdom. She manages it competently. She aligns with a larger power. She loses when that power reorganizes itself. That's it. No curses, no destiny, no divine punishment. Just geopolitics. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all, because it means Cleopatra wasn't exceptional because of who she loved or how she died. She was exceptional because she lasted 21 years in a dynasty famous for chaos, in a world dominated by Rome. She delayed the inevitable, and sometimes that's the only victory available. So if Cleopatra feels oddly familiar, if she feels modern or relevant or frustratingly unresolved, that's because she represents something history still hasn't learned how to talk about gently. Competent women in collapsing systems. There's no myth that wraps neatly around that. So the story keeps looping, and we keep listening. And now, as this part drifts towards its own quiet end, it's okay to stop asking new questions. Cleopatra doesn't need them anymore. She's already done the work. She remains, not loudly, not clearly, just present, like history itself. All right, this is the late stretch now, the part where history stops trying to teach lessons and just exists, like rain on a window. Like a voice you've heard so often it doesn't need to finish its sentences. Cleopatra has followed us a long way to get here, from a living queen to a Roman warning to a Renaissance painting to a Hollywood costume budget. And now she's just part of the furniture. A name everyone knows, a figure everyone recognizes, a story most people can half recall while brushing their teeth. That's a strange kind of immortality. Cleopatra didn't become obscure. She became familiar. So familiar that we stop noticing how odd her story actually is. A woman ruled Egypt for 2 decades, negotiated directly with the most powerful men in the world, lost to empire, and then dominated cultural memory anyway. That shouldn't be normal, but it is, because repetition smooths things out. By the time a story reaches bedtime status, the kind you can half listen to while drifting off, it's lost its sharp edges. Cleopatra's story has been sanded down over centuries of retelling. The chaos of Alexandrian politics, the desperation of Roman civil war, the constant calculations, all of that fades. What remains is atmosphere. Gold, perfume, ships on water, a woman reclining somewhere, doing something vaguely important. It's comfortable. And comfort is the opposite of accuracy. But comfort is what stories turn into when they survive long enough. Cleopatra now exists in that soft zone. Not quite history, not quite fiction. A historical lullaby. And maybe that's appropriate, because Cleopatra's real life was anything but restful. She lived under constant surveillance, constant pressure, constant expectation. Every alliance scrutinized, every public appearance interpreted. There was no off switch. So perhaps being remembered as something calm and familiar is a kind of mercy, a long exhale after a very tight hold. Modern retellings often promise to reveal the real Cleopatra, as if she's been hiding somewhere, waiting patiently. But there is no single real version left. There's the administrative Cleopatra, the propagandized Cleopatra, the mythic Cleopatra. They all overlap, and none of them cancel each other out. That's another reason she endures. Cleopatra isn't fragile. She absorbs interpretation. You can pile meanings on her story, and it doesn't collapse. It just expands. And eventually, it becomes ambient, like now, at this hour, where Cleopatra isn't a queen or a symbol or a scandal. She's just a voice in the dark. A reminder that history is made of people who once worried about tomorrow, who once tried to hold things together, who once failed quietly in ways that felt enormous at the time. Cleopatra's failure just happened to be very public. Most failures aren't remembered. That's the difference. And it's not a moral one. It's an accident of skill. So when Cleopatra drifts through documentaries, podcasts, and late-night videos like this one, she's not really being judged anymore. She's being used for atmosphere, a familiar anchor, something old enough to feel safe. And there's something deeply human about that. We turn difficult lives into soothing stories once they're far enough away. We soften the pain. We mute the urgency. We let the danger pass. Cleopatra's life no longer threatens anyone, so it can finally rest, even if it took 2,000 years to get there. So if you're barely listening now, if the words are blending together, that's fine. This is where Cleopatra ends up anyway. Not in battle, not in spectacle, but in the background. A name that hums softly behind the present. A reminder that power fades, empires pass, and stories keep looping long after the people are gone. And that's not tragic. It's just how time works. So let the story keep playing, or let it fade out completely. Cleopatra doesn't mind either way. She's already lasted longer than she ever expected. All right, we're well past the point of urgency now. This is the hour where the story barely moves, and that's intentional. Cleopatra has already done everything she's going to do. What remains is how we keep arranging her. Because Cleopatra, at this stage, functions less like a person and more like a placeholder. When history wants to talk about ambition, it reaches for Cleopatra. When it wants to talk about female power, Cleopatra shows up again. When it wants to talk about the fall of a great civilization, there she is. Not because she fits perfectly, but because she's recognizable. She's a convenient shape to pour meaning into. This happens a lot with figures who sit at crossroads, the end of something, the beginning of something else. Cleopatra lived at the end of Hellenistic Egypt, at the transition from republic to empire. She stands right on the seam. History loves seams. They're easier to point at than slow processes. It's easier to say Cleopatra fell and Egypt fell with her than to admit that Egypt had been structurally doomed for decades. It's easier to say Antony was ruined by love than to say Rome's political system had been eating itself alive for a century. Cleopatra becomes the shortcut, a single face to represent collapse. And shortcuts are comforting. They make history feel manageable. But Cleopatra's real story resists that simplicity. Her reign doesn't feel like an ending when you look at it closely. It feels like maintenance, holding systems together, delaying outcomes, buying time. That kind of work is invisible. No monuments, no speeches that survive intact, just records, coins, administrative traces. So when that work finally fails, history rushes in to explain it emotionally, and Cleopatra absorbs that explanation. She becomes excess, she becomes decadence, she becomes distraction, because those are more interesting than balance sheets, and because blaming a woman for decline has always been an easy move. This doesn't make Cleopatra unique, it just makes her useful. We can see the same pattern over and over. Women in power remembered for their personalities, men in power remembered for their policies. Cleopatra's personality becomes the story, her governance becomes footnotes. And over time, even those footnotes fade. What remains is a vibe. You don't need to know when Cleopatra ruled to recognize her name. You don't need to know what she did to picture her. That's rare. Most historical figures require context. Cleopatra floats free of it, which is why she keeps appearing. She's easy to summon. Say her name and everyone has an image, even if the image is wrong, and maybe especially because it's wrong. Accuracy requires effort. Myth just needs repetition. So Cleopatra continues as a kind of historical shorthand. Foreign queen, dangerous beauty, political chaos. Even when modern scholars carefully dismantle those ideas, the shorthand remains because it's comfortable, and comfort always outlives correction. This is not a failure of scholarship, it's just how memory works. We remember shapes before details. Cleopatra's shape is unmistakable, and so she stays, hovering at the edge of conversations about power, gender, empire, and decline, not speaking, not defending herself, just being referenced. And there's something oddly peaceful about that. Cleopatra no longer has to act, no longer has to perform. She's already been cast. The role changes depending on the era, but the name remains the same, which means Cleopatra has become less a historical figure and more a constant, a fixed point people return to when they need an example. That's not immortality in the heroic sense, it's something quieter, persistence through usefulness. Cleopatra survives because she's still doing work for history, even now, even here. And as this part drifts toward its own ending, there's no need to resolve that tension. Cleopatra doesn't need to be rescued from myth entirely. She's been living with it for 2,000 years. She's adapted. And we, listening half asleep, adapt too. We stop trying to pin her down. We let her be what she's become. A familiar outline, a recurring name, a story that doesn't demand full attention anymore. Just presence. And presence, at this hour, is more than enough. All right. This is the stretch where even the idea of an ending feels unnecessary. Not because the story isn't finished, but because it finished a long time ago, and we're just letting the echo taper off naturally. Cleopatra doesn't really have a final scene, not in the way history usually likes. There's no neat moral, no lesson wrapped in ribbon, no clear point where everyone agrees the story stops. She just fades, and that might be the most honest ending she could have. Most historical figures get boxed into conclusions. They're declared successes or failures, heroes or villains. Cleopatra resists that. Every attempt to pin her down slides sideways. If she was a failure, she failed impressively late. If she was reckless, she was recklessly effective for over 2 decades. If she was merely lucky, her luck lasted longer than most dynasties manage competence. None of the labels quite stick. So, history does what it always does when something won't cooperate. It stops pushing and lets the thing become atmosphere. Cleopatra becomes background radiation in Western culture, always faintly present, never urgent. You see her name on book covers you don't quite read. You hear her referenced in conversations that don't linger. She's there, but not demanding anything, which is a strange fate for someone who once commanded fleets and negotiated with emperors. But it's also peaceful. Cleopatra spent her entire life being interpreted in real time by advisors, by rivals, by foreign powers. Everyone was always watching, always deciding what she meant. Now, no one needs her to mean anything specific. She's allowed to be ambiguous, and ambiguity is restful. At this distance, Cleopatra's story doesn't feel tragic anymore. It feels complete. She lived in a world that was closing in. She pushed back where she could, and she lost when the pressure became structural rather than personal. That's not drama. That's physics. Empires expand. Smaller powers adapt or dissolve. Cleopatra adapted longer than most. There's no shame in that. If anything, there's clarity. And clarity, at this hour, is enough. So as we hover here, not quite ending, not quite continuing, it's okay to stop expecting more from her story. Cleopatra doesn't owe us inspiration. She doesn't owe us caution. She doesn't owe us representation or redemption. She already lived. Everything after that is commentary, and commentary eventually quiets down. So let the name soften. Let the image blur. Let Cleopatra become what all long-surviving stories eventually become. A presence you don't question. A reference you don't chase. A voice you've heard so often it feels almost internal. Not loud, not dramatic, just there. And if sleep takes you somewhere in the middle of this thought, if the words dissolve before they land, that's fine. Cleopatra has been dissolving into memory for 2,000 years. She's very good at it by now. All right, this is the part where the story is mostly quiet now. Not silent, just settled. Cleopatra has been resting in the background for a while. We've stopped asking her to explain herself. We've stopped demanding conclusions. And yet she hasn't gone away. That's the thing. Most historical figures fade because they stop being useful. Their context disappears. Their relevance dissolves. Cleopatra never quite reaches that point. She lingers, not because new evidence keeps surfacing, not because her story changes dramatically, but because the world keeps circling the same questions she once lived inside. Power, identity, collapse, image. Those don't age out. So Cleopatra remains, hovering gently at the edge of those conversations, not arguing, not defending, just existing as a reference point. She's the name people reach for when they want to talk about a woman who ruled without permission, about a culture absorbed by a larger system, about the uncomfortable overlap between competence and spectacle. Even when people get her wrong, they're still pointing at something real. That's why she survives misinterpretation. Cleopatra has been misunderstood so thoroughly for so long that misunderstanding no longer threatens her. It just slides off. Corrective scholarship comes and goes. New portrayals appear. Old ones fade. Cleopatra stays, not fixed, but stable, which is strange considering how unstable her life actually was. She grew up watching power fail. She ruled knowing collapse was possible at any moment. She negotiated with men who could erase her with paperwork and legions. There was nothing stable about that. And yet, here she is, 2,000 years later, still recognizable, still discussed. That endurance doesn't come from spectacle alone. Plenty of dramatic figures vanish anyway. Cleopatra endures because her story doesn't resolve into a moral. It refuses to teach a clean lesson. She didn't fall because she was immoral. She didn't succeed because she was virtuous. She didn't lose because she loved the wrong person. She lost because larger forces shifted. And that's unsettling. It suggests that intelligence, preparation, and effort don't always save you, that sometimes survival is about scale, not merit. History doesn't love that idea, but it can't get rid of Cleopatra without confronting it. So she stays, softened, aestheticized, repeated, but still present. And now, at this point in the night, that presence doesn't demand anything. Cleopatra doesn't need to be reclaimed. She doesn't need to be defended. She doesn't need to be corrected one last time. She's already absorbed all of that. She's beyond it, which makes her oddly peaceful. Not triumphant, not tragic, just complete. So, if your thoughts are drifting now, if Cleopatra feels less like a person and more like a familiar name floating past, that's not a failure of attention. That's the final shape of long memory, the point where history stops insisting and starts humming. Cleopatra has reached that point. She's no longer asking to be understood. She's just there. And that's enough. All right. This is the deep quiet now. The hour where even the idea of staying awake feels optional. Cleopatra has been with us for a long time, and she doesn't need much from us anymore. At this point, Cleopatra exists less as a story and more as a background condition, like gravity, like the ocean. You don't notice it all the time, but it's always there, shaping things gently. Her name still appears in textbooks, documentaries, and late-night conversations that trail off halfway through a sentence. But no one expects closure from her anymore. That expectation is gone. History has finally learned that Cleopatra doesn't resolve neatly. She doesn't arrive at a moral. She doesn't tidy herself into a lesson. She simply ends and keeps going. That sounds contradictory, but it isn't. Cleopatra's life ended very clearly. The politics moved on, Rome reorganized, Egypt became something else. But the idea of Cleopatra drifted free. And once an idea detaches from urgency, it becomes calm. That's where we are now. Cleopatra has become one of those figures who no longer belongs to the past in a strict sense. She belongs to memory. And memory is slower than history, softer, less precise. Memory doesn't care if every detail is right. It cares if the outline feels familiar. Cleopatra's outline is unmistakable. A woman at the edge of power, a world shifting under her feet, an empire pressing inward. That outline still makes sense to us, which is why it still floats by, even now. But notice how quiet it's become. There's no urgency left in her story, no warning, no call to action, just presence. That's usually where historical figures end up when enough time passes. They stop being arguments, they stop being examples, they become part of the furniture of the past. Cleopatra has finally reached that stage, not because people stopped caring, but because they stopped needing her to mean something specific. She's no longer required to carry debates about morality, gender, or decline on her back. Those debates have moved on, or softened. Cleopatra remains behind, untouched by the urgency that once surrounded her. And that's a kind of release. For centuries, she was asked to explain too much, to justify ambition, to embody danger, to symbolize collapse. Now she doesn't have to do any of that. She's allowed to be incomplete, and incompleteness is restful. There's no pressure here, no climax coming, no twist waiting, just the long, even exhale of time passing. Cleopatra lived intensely, she died decisively, and then she waited to be argued over, waited to be mythologized, waited to be softened. And now she waits for nothing at all. That's the final quiet. So if your thoughts are drifting away now, if Cleopatra feels like a distant hum rather than a voice, that's exactly right. This is where the story naturally comes to rest. Not ended, not resolved, just set down. Cleopatra doesn't vanish, she never quite does, but she no longer insists on being heard. And at this hour, that's the kindest ending history ever gives anyone. All right, we're well past structure now, past conclusions, past the part where history pretends it's going somewhere specific. This is the stretch where the story just wanders, which is fitting because Cleopatra's afterlife has been one long, unhurried wandering through other people's thoughts. There's no new evidence waiting to appear here, no sudden reinterpretation that changes everything. Just the slow settling of a figure who has been talked about too much for too long and is finally allowed to rest in the margins. Cleopatra, at this distance, isn't dramatic anymore. She's familiar, almost domestic. Her name doesn't raise eyebrows, it doesn't demand explanation. It slides easily into conversation, into metaphor, into background reference. That's what happens when a story survives long enough. It stops feeling historical and starts feeling inevitable. Cleopatra feels like she was always there, which is strange because her life was anything but inevitable. She lived with contingency every day, alliances shifting, favor evaporating, power hanging by a thread that could snap without warning. Nothing about her situation was guaranteed, and yet now, in memory, she feels stable. That's the trick time plays. It smooths out uncertainty until everything looks like it unfolded exactly as it should have, as if Cleopatra's rise and fall were scripted. They weren't. They were improvised, reactive, calculated moment by moment. But improvisation doesn't survive well in long memory. It gets rewritten as destiny. So Cleopatra becomes inevitable, a queen who had to fall, a dynasty that had to end, which makes us comfortable. Inevitability lets us relax. If things had to happen that way, then no one needs to be blamed too carefully. No one needs to sit with the discomfort of how close outcomes sometimes are. Cleopatra's story, told softly enough, becomes reassurance. Empires rise, empires fall. Individuals do what they can inside that motion, nothing personal. And at this hour, that's a soothing idea. Cleopatra didn't fail because she was flawed. She didn't lose because she miscalculated one fatal move. She lost because history shifted scale. Rome stopped negotiating and started absorbing. That happens. It's happened before. It will happen again. Cleopatra just happened to be standing at the edge when it did. There's something oddly calming about that realization. It strips away drama. It strips away judgment. What's left is process, and process doesn't keep you awake at night. Cleopatra becomes a reminder that not every ending needs to be read as tragedy. Some endings are just transitions that happen to have names attached to them. Egypt didn't vanish when Cleopatra died. It changed. Cleopatra didn't vanish either. She changed form, from ruler to reference, from participant to symbol, from problem to background. That's not a fall, it's a transformation, and transformation is quiet. It doesn't announce itself, it just slowly becomes the new normal. Cleopatra has been normal for a very long time now. So normal that we forget how strange her life actually was. A Greek-speaking Macedonian queen, ruling Egypt as Isis, negotiating with Roman warlords, balancing dynastic tradition with survival. None of that should feel ordinary, but repetition makes it feel that way. And repetition is gentle. It's the same story told so many times that it loses sharpness, edges blur, details fade. What remains is rhythm. Cleopatra's story has a rhythm that people find comforting. Rise, balance, pressure, loss. It mirrors patterns we recognize elsewhere. That's why it keeps resurfacing, not because it's shocking, but because it's familiar. Familiar enough to drift alongside us while we think about other things. And now, as this part stretches out without urgency, Cleopatra stops being someone we're thinking about and starts being someone we're thinking with. She becomes a reference point we don't actively consult, just a presence we assume is there, like knowing Rome existed, like knowing empires don't last. Cleopatra settles into that mental category. Not lesson, not warning, just example. An example that doesn't ask anything of us. She doesn't demand admiration. She doesn't demand condemnation. She just was. And in that sense, Cleopatra becomes oddly peaceful. Her life was spent under scrutiny. Her afterlife was spent under interpretation. Only now, this far removed, does she finally get something like quiet. Not silence, but quiet. The low hum of recognition without urgency, which is where long stories are supposed to end up. Not with a bang, not with a moral, but with a sense that everything that needed to happen already has. So if this part feels like it's looping, circling the same ideas without moving forward, that's intentional, because Cleopatra's story doesn't move forward anymore. It just circulates, and circulation is restful. It means nothing is being decided, nothing is at stake, just the steady movement of memory doing what it does best, holding on without gripping too tightly. So let Cleopatra keep drifting, let her remain unfinished. She's been carrying the weight of meaning for centuries. She can afford to be light now. And if your thoughts fade here, if the words blur into rhythm, that's exactly where this story wants to be. Not concluded, not resolved, just continuing, softly, without effort. All right. We're deep into the hours where time stops behaving properly. Minutes stretch, thoughts repeat themselves gently, and history becomes less of a subject and more of a texture. This is where Cleopatra exists now, as texture, not sharp, not defined, just present. At this distance, Cleopatra isn't doing anything. She isn't ruling, she isn't falling, she isn't being judged or redeemed. She's just there. And that's oddly rare for historical figures. Most of them are locked into moments, a battle, a speech, a decision that everything else bends around. Cleopatra doesn't have one of those anymore. Even her death, once dramatic, has softened. The snake is barely moving now. The poison barely registers. It's all been retold too many times to retain urgency. So Cleopatra drifts. She becomes the queen you half remember from a textbook, the name you recognize instantly but struggle to place precisely, the face that changes depending on who's telling the story. And that's fine. At this point, precision would feel intrusive. Cleopatra has earned ambiguity. Her life was lived under relentless definition, Roman writers defining her as a threat, Later artists defining her as spectacle, modern audiences defining her as symbol. She was always being turned into something. Only now, centuries later, does she finally get to be undefined. That's not erasure, it's rest. History, when it goes on long enough, eventually stops insisting. It stops pushing meaning and starts allowing presence. Cleopatra has reached that stage. She no longer needs defending from Roman propaganda. She no longer needs rescuing from Hollywood excess. Those battles are over, quietly. What remains is a figure who absorbed more projection than most people could survive and still remained recognizable. That's not fragility, that's durability. Cleopatra didn't endure because she was flawless. She endured because her story was flexible. It could stretch, it could bend, it could carry contradictions without breaking. That's why it keeps resurfacing. Not sharply, not urgently, but persistently. Cleopatra's name floats through time like a buoy, not pulling anything up, just marking where something once mattered deeply, and maybe still does, in a quieter way. Think about how often Cleopatra appears without context. A headline in a reference, a metaphor in an article, a name dropped in passing. No explanation needed. That's a rare kind of fame. It's the kind that doesn't demand attention, it assumes it. Cleopatra has become assumed knowledge, and assumed knowledge is comfortable. It lets us relax. We don't need to verify every detail. We don't need to argue every interpretation. We already know enough to feel oriented. So Cleopatra becomes a mental landmark rather than a destination. You don't travel to her, you pass by her. And passing by is gentle. At this hour, gentleness matters. Cleopatra's real life was not gentle, but memory doesn't owe reality accuracy forever. Eventually, memory turns everything into something livable. That's what's happening here. Cleopatra is being made livable. No longer a warning, no longer a temptation, no longer a scandal. Just a figure who once stood at the edge of immense change. Edges are quiet places once you step away from them, and Cleopatra has been stepped away from for a very long time now. Her world collapsed into Rome. Rome collapsed into something else. That something else collapsed too. Civilizations stacked on top of each other like sediment. Cleopatra sits buried somewhere in the middle, still visible if you look closely, but no longer exposed. And there's something comforting about that. She isn't under a spotlight anymore. She's under layers. Layers soften sound. They muffle impact. They allow rest. So if this part feels like it's moving very slowly, like it's circling familiar ideas without pushing them forward, that's because there's nowhere left to push. The story has arrived at stillness. Not an ending, not a conclusion, just stillness. Cleopatra doesn't need a final interpretation. She doesn't need a definitive portrait. She's been reinterpreted enough times to outgrow that need. She exists now as part of the long background hum of human history. Always there, never urgent. And that hum is steady. It doesn't spike, it doesn't fade completely, it just continues. Like this. So let the story keep breathing quietly. Let Cleopatra remain unresolved. She's carried meaning for centuries. She can afford to be weightless now. And if sleep takes you somewhere in the middle of this spot, if the words become less important than the rhythm, that's exactly where Cleopatra lives now anyway. Not in the details, not in the arguments, but in the slow, even drift of time passing. All right, we're so far into this now that the story isn't really a story anymore. It's more like a low, steady sound in the other room, the kind you notice only when it stops. Cleopatra lives there now, not front and center, not demanding attention, just quietly existing as part of the mental environment. At this point, Cleopatra is less a historical figure and more a reference temperature, a baseline, something you measure other things against without realizing you're doing it. Powerful woman in history? Cleopatra comes up. A kingdom about to be swallowed by a larger one? Cleopatra again. Charisma mistaken for danger? Somehow still Cleopatra. She's not being summoned, she just appears. And that's what long-term historical presence looks like. The urgency is gone. The arguments have cooled. The sharp edges have worn smooth from handling. What's left is familiarity. Cleopatra is familiar in the way ancient furniture is familiar. You don't remember when it arrived, you don't remember who put it there. It's just always been in the room. And like old furniture, she's been reupholstered countless times. Victorian Cleopatra, Hollywood Cleopatra, academic Cleopatra, internet Cleopatra. Different fabrics, same frame. That frame is sturdy. A woman navigating power with limited options. A ruler trying to preserve autonomy while everything tilts against her. A person who understood performance before the word existed in its modern sense. That doesn't age badly. It doesn't shock us anymore, but it still resonates quietly. Cleopatra doesn't feel ancient in the way some figures do. She doesn't feel sealed off. She feels adjacent, like someone whose problems were extreme versions of very ordinary human concerns. Security, recognition, control, legacy. Those don't expire. And that's why Cleopatra never quite fades out. She becomes less specific, but more applicable. Not a lesson you're taught, a mood you recognize. At this hour, moods matter more than facts. Facts are sharp, moods are soft. Cleopatra has drifted firmly into mood territory. The mood of late power, the mood of things slipping without immediate collapse, the mood of holding something together because there's nothing else to do. That mood feels strangely modern, which is probably why Cleopatra keeps reappearing even when no one is actively looking for her. She fits into conversations about influence, image, and survival without forcing her way in. She belongs there naturally, and natural belonging is quiet. No explanation required. Think about how rarely people now argue whether Cleopatra mattered. That debate is over. The only questions left are texture questions. What did she sound like? What did she prioritize day to day? What did she worry about when nothing was actively on fire? Those are gentle questions. They don't lead to conflict. They lead to imagining. Imagining Cleopatra in downtime. Cleopatra waiting. Cleopatra listening. Cleopatra sitting through meetings that could have been emails if emails had existed. Those moments never made it into history books, but that's where she probably spent most of her life, waiting, managing, repeating herself, which makes her feel even more distant and even more relatable. Cleopatra wasn't living in constant drama. Drama is what survives. Most of her days were probably administrative, routine, predictable. That's comforting. It means history wasn't always loud, and Cleopatra, despite the reputation, wasn't always intense. She had long stretches of maintenance, of stability, of quiet competence. Those stretches don't get adapted into movies. They don't inspire myths. But they're where real life happens. And realizing that flattens the story in a soothing way. Cleopatra stops being exceptional every minute of her existence. She becomes a person doing a job for a long time under worsening conditions. That's not tragic. That's human. And humanity is calming. So now Cleopatra rests there. Not as spectacle, not as scandal, but as someone who once navigated complexity without the benefit of hindsight. We have hindsight. She didn't. That difference softens judgment. It makes the whole story feel less sharp, less urgent, which is exactly what this hour calls for. No revelations left, no twists remaining, just the gentle realization that even the most mythologized lives were mostly ordinary, stretched across extraordinary circumstances. Cleopatra doesn't need defending. She doesn't need praising. She's already drifted past that phase. She exists now in the way old stories do when they've been told enough times. They don't demand belief. They don't demand disbelief. They just exist. And if this part feels like it's slowly dissolving into repetition, circling the same ideas in slightly different words, that's intentional, because repetition is the sound of something settling. Cleopatra has settled, not into a conclusion, not into a verdict, just into the long background hum of history doing what it always does in the end, lowering its voice, letting the story stay where it is. All right. This is the hour where even curiosity gets tired, where questions soften into impressions, where history stops tapping you on the shoulder and just sits nearby. Cleopatra is very comfortable here. At this distance, she no longer feels like someone who lived then. She feels like someone who has always existed in a vague, sideways way. Not chronological, not linear, more like a shadow that shifts shape depending on the light. You don't chase it, you don't analyze it, you just notice it's there, and then you don't. Cleopatra has become one of those figures who no longer needs to be actively remembered. She's remembered passively, the way you remember the idea of Rome without picturing every brick, the way you remember the ocean without recalling a specific wave. She's part of the mental landscape, and landscapes don't require attention to function. They just exist. For a long time, Cleopatra was treated like a puzzle, something to solve, something to decode. What did she really want? What was she really like? Was she clever or manipulative, strategic or emotional? Those questions used to matter. They don't anymore. Not because answers were found, but because the need for answers faded. That's what time does when it stretches far enough. It doesn't clarify, it deactivates. It lowers the stakes until curiosity feels optional. Cleopatra's life has been turned over so many times that it's worn smooth. There are no sharp corners left to catch on, only surfaces. And smooth surfaces are restful. You can let your attention drift across them without resistance. That's why Cleopatra works so well at this hour. There's nothing left to grasp tightly, nothing left to argue with, just a presence that's been handled gently into neutrality. She was once dangerous, once controversial, once endlessly debated. Now she's familiar. Familiar in the way that makes the brain relax instead of engage. And that's not a loss, it's a transformation. Cleopatra didn't fade because she stopped mattering. She faded because she mattered long enough to become stable. Stability is quiet. Unstable stories demand attention. Stable ones hum in the background. Cleopatra hums now. A steady frequency. Not loud enough to interrupt thought, not silent enough to disappear. Just enough to be there. Think about how many generations have already finished arguing about her. How many people lived entire lives where Cleopatra was already ancient. Even the Romans thought she was a figure of another world. That kind of distance compounds, layer after layer of people who inherited her story already softened, already interpreted, already filtered. By the time it reaches us, it's barely warm, and warmth without heat is soothing. Cleopatra's story no longer burns. It glows faintly. You don't gather around it. You don't build anything with it. You just let it sit there, which is exactly what we're doing now. No forward motion, no destination, just staying with the idea until it dissolves into rhythm. Cleopatra, at this point, doesn't even feel singular. She blends with other names, other queens, other endings. She becomes part of a collective memory of how power looks when it's late in its life. Late power is quiet power. It's careful, measured, often misunderstood as weakness. Cleopatra lived in that phase, and now she exists in another late phase, late memory, where nothing needs to be proven, where nothing is urgent, just presence. And presence doesn't hurry. If your thoughts are wandering now, if Cleopatra feels less like a person and more like a tone, that's exactly right. This is the tone of history finally letting go of insistence, not forgetting, just loosening its grip. Cleopatra doesn't slip away entirely, she never quite does. She just stops asking to be focused on. And at this hour, that's the most generous thing a story can do. All right, this is the point where even drifting feels like too much effort, where the story isn't drifting anymore. It's floating. Cleopatra has reached complete stillness. Not erased, not concluded, just settled. If stories had sediment, this is where she'd be. Not on the surface, not buried beyond reach, just resting in a middle layer where pressure no longer changes her shape. At this distance, Cleopatra doesn't feel like a sequence of events. She feels like a memory you're not sure is yours. You didn't live it, you didn't experience it, but you recognize it anyway. That's the final phase of historical presence. Not knowledge, not interpretation, recognition. Cleopatra is recognized before she's understood, named before she's examined. Her outline arrives before details ever matter. And outlines are calming. They don't demand focus, they don't surprise you, they just confirm that something familiar exists nearby. Cleopatra exists like that now. She's no longer introduced, she's assumed. There's no need to explain who she was. Everyone already knows enough. Enough to feel oriented. Enough to move on. And moving on is quiet. For a long time, Cleopatra's story moved forward through reinterpretation, each generation adjusting her slightly, sharpening here, softening there. But reinterpretation slows eventually, not because it's exhausted, but because it's no longer necessary. Cleopatra doesn't need updates. She doesn't need correction. She's already absorbed contradiction. She can hold intelligence and performance at the same time, strength and vulnerability, strategy and desperation. Nothing collapses under that weight anymore. And once a story can hold everything without strain, it stops moving. It rests. Cleopatra has rested into completeness. Not completeness in facts, but completeness in feeling. There's nothing left to add that would change the shape. That's a peaceful place for a story to arrive. Her life no longer invites argument. It invites recognition, and then quiet, which is exactly what we're doing now, sitting with a name that once shook empires and now barely disturbs the air. That's not diminishing. That's resolution of a different kind. Not an ending, a saturation point. Cleopatra has been thought about enough. Enough that thinking about her no longer produces tension, just familiarity. She doesn't feel tragic anymore. Tragedy requires sharpness. She doesn't feel triumphant either. Triumph needs contrast. She feels neutral. And neutrality is deeply restful. It means nothing is being asked of you, no opinion required, no stance demanded. Cleopatra simply exists as part of the deep background of human experience. People rose, people ruled, people adapted, people lost. This happened. And now, it's done. Not erased, not forgotten, just done. If you notice your breathing slowing here, if the story feels less like words and more like cadence, that's exactly where this part belongs. Cleopatra isn't speaking anymore. History isn't speaking either. It's humming. And the hum doesn't need interpretation. It just needs to be there, steady, unchanging, until attention drifts somewhere else entirely. Cleopatra will remain. She always does. But she won't follow you. She stays here, in the quiet, fully settled. All right. This is the part where the story doesn't even realize you're still here. Not because it's careless, but because it doesn't need witnesses anymore. Cleopatra is doing just fine on her own now. At this depth, she's no longer interacting with the present. She's not being referenced, not being reinterpreted. She's simply existing in the long, quiet archive of things that once mattered intensely. And archives are very calm places. Nothing rushes, nothing competes for attention. Everything waits. Cleopatra has learned how to wait. She waited in life, for allies, for tides to turn, for Rome to hesitate. And she waits now in memory, but without expectation. No one is coming to ask her questions. No one is coming to argue with her reputation. She's already been asked everything. At this point, Cleopatra's story doesn't even loop anymore. Loops require motion. This is more like suspension. Her name hangs there, weightless, not pulling meaning toward it, not pushing anything away, just hanging. That's what happens when history finally releases tension. For a long time, Cleopatra was treated as unfinished business, something unresolved, something still relevant in an active way. But relevance ages too. Eventually, relevance becomes familiarity. Familiarity becomes texture. And texture doesn't demand engagement. It's just part of the surface you rest on. Cleopatra has become that surface. You don't stand on her story anymore. You lie down near it. And lying down is quiet work. Think about how far away her world really is. The language, the customs, the assumptions, none of them belong to us anymore. And yet her name still slips easily into our thoughts. That's not accuracy. That's endurance. Cleopatra endured not because her story was dramatic, but because it was adaptable. It could survive being retold badly. It could survive exaggeration. It could survive misunderstanding. And now it can survive being ignored for long stretches. That's the final test of a historical figure. Not whether they're remembered constantly, but whether they remain intact during silence. Cleopatra does. She doesn't erode when unattended. She doesn't collapse without commentary. She simply remains, which is a very quiet form of success. At this point, Cleopatra no longer feels like a woman who lived. She feels like a concept that learned how to rest. Not a warning, not an inspiration, just a reminder that lives don't need clean endings to be complete. Her ending was abrupt. Her afterlife was loud. But now it's neither. It's even. If you listen closely, there's no emotional spike here, no lingering sadness, no unresolved tension, just the sense that everything that could happen has already happened, and that's deeply relaxing. Cleopatra doesn't need you to stay awake for her. She doesn't need attention. She's been attended to enough. So if this part feels like it's slowly dissolving, like the words are becoming less distinct, that's intentional, because Cleopatra has dissolved into the background of history, not vanished, just blended, and blending is peaceful. There's nothing left to hold on to tightly, nothing left to follow. The story doesn't end here. It doesn't even stop. It simply continues without noticing. and you're free to drift away whenever you like. Cleopatra will still be here, quiet, unmoving, unbothered, exactly where long stories go when they finally stop needing to be told. Part 19. Cleopatra Unattended, when the story exists without an audience. All right, this is the part where the room feels a little emptier, but also calmer, like someone turned off a light you didn't realize was on. Cleopatra doesn't notice. She passed the point of needing to be noticed a long time ago. At this depth, the story is no longer performing. It isn't pacing itself. It isn't checking whether anyone is still listening. It's just existing in its own quiet state. Cleopatra has become self-sustaining. No narration required, no framing device, no voiceover needed to keep her relevant. Her presence doesn't fluctuate with attention anymore. That's rare. Most historical figures fade when the spotlight moves on. They need reminders. They need anniversaries. They need documentaries to pull them back into focus. Cleopatra doesn't. She exists comfortably in neglect. Neglect in this case isn't dismissal, it's trust. Trust that her story doesn't need maintenance, that it won't unravel if left alone. And it doesn't. Cleopatra's story is remarkably low maintenance now. It doesn't demand context. It doesn't collapse under silence. It just sits there, intact, like an old structure that stopped weathering because nothing is pushing against it anymore. Windless. Still. This is where stories end up when they've been told enough times. Not finished, not forgotten, just unattended. And unattended things are often the most peaceful. There's no pressure to respond, no pressure to explain. Cleopatra doesn't have to justify her choices anymore. She doesn't have to defend her intelligence or her ambition. Those conversations have already happened. They burned themselves out. Nothing new is being demanded of her. So she rests. Not dramatically, not symbolically, just functionally. Think of Cleopatra now less as a person and more as a quiet coordinate on a map. You don't stare at it, you don't zoom in, you just know it's there. That knowledge is enough. The brain relaxes when it knows it doesn't have to do anything with information. Cleopatra's story has reached that point. No processing required, no emotional reaction expected, just presence. At this stage, even her most famous associations lose their edge. Rome feels distant, empire feels abstract, power feels neutral. Everything has been drained of urgency. Urgency doesn't survive this far out. Only shape remains. The shape of a life lived at the edge of change, the shape of adaptation, the shape of something ending without chaos. Those shapes are gentle. They don't interrupt sleep. If anything, they encourage it. Cleopatra's story has flattened into something like a horizon, always there, never moving closer. You don't approach it, you don't leave it behind. It simply stays where it is. And now even this narration is unnecessary. The story doesn't need words anymore. Words are for motion, for explanation. Cleopatra has none of that left to do. She's already arrived. So if this part feels especially slow, if the sentences feel like they're stretching out and thinning, that's because there's nothing left to hold tightly. The story has slipped into a state where attention is optional. You can stay, you can drift. It doesn't matter. Cleopatra won't change either way. She remains, unattended, unbothered, at rest. Exactly where long history goes, once it no longer needs to be watched. All right, this is the part where an ending would usually arrive. A gentle wrap-up. A final sentence that quietly clicks the door shut. But Cleopatra doesn't really do doors. She does thresholds. And thresholds don't close. They just stay where they are. So instead of an ending, we just remain here for a bit longer. Cleopatra is still present. Not active, not reactive, just present in the way old things are present. At this stage, the story isn't moving forward or backward. It's not even resting anymore. It's simply occupying space. Cleopatra occupies historical space the way a mountain occupies a horizon. You don't interact with it. You don't expect it to change. You just know it's there. And knowing something is there without needing to do anything about it is deeply calming. That's what Cleopatra has become. Not a narrative, not a figure, a constant. For centuries, she was treated as an event, something that happened, something that caused other things to happen. Now she's treated as a condition of history itself. When people think about power, decline, image, or survival, Cleopatra is already folded into those thoughts before anyone says her name. She's preloaded. And preloaded ideas don't make noise. They just sit quietly in the background, ready if needed, unbothered if not. That's the final transformation. Cleopatra has become optional. Optional presence, optional meaning. And optional things are the easiest to live with. There's no pressure to engage, no expectation to respond correctly. You can drift past her without consequence. She won't demand your attention. She won't follow you. She'll just remain, exactly where she has been for a very long time now. Think about how little effort it takes to recognize her name. No strain, no search. Recognition happens automatically. That's not memory working hard. That's memory at rest. Cleopatra has been fully absorbed, not memorized, absorbed. She's dissolved into the long-term structures of how we understand the past, which means she doesn't need to be revisited. She doesn't need refreshing. She's already everywhere she needs to be. And that's why even this part feels like it's refusing to end, because there's nothing to conclude, no final insight, no closing argument, just the continued existence of something that no longer requires narration. This isn't a cliffhanger. It's the opposite. It's a plateau. Flat, stable, unchanging. Cleopatra reached it a long time ago. We're just arriving late. And arriving late is fine. No one's waiting. So if your attention drifts now, if the words blur into a soft, repetitive cadence, that's not disengagement. That's alignment. You've caught up to where the story already is. Not ending, not continuing, just there. Cleopatra will remain there, long after this narration fades, long after the need to explain disappears. Quiet, unmoved, undemanding. Exactly how long history prefers to keep the things it can't quite let go of, but no longer needs to hold. All right. This is the part where time itself stops asking questions. No updates, no revisions, no quiet urge to see if anything has shifted. Nothing has. Cleopatra remains exactly where she was the last time we passed by. At this point, she isn't moving forward through history. History is moving around her. Calendars flip, centuries stack, ideas rise and dissolve. Cleopatra stays put. That's what happens when something becomes fully integrated. It no longer travels, it anchors. Her story has anchored itself into the collective sense of long ago, but not in a distant, unreachable way. More like a fixed star. You don't visit it, you orient by it. And orientation is quiet work. Cleopatra doesn't provoke thought anymore. She stabilizes it. When people imagine ancient power, she's already there. When they imagine the end of a world, she's already present. No effort required. And effortlessness is soothing. For a long time, Cleopatra was used to explain things, to dramatize change, to embody decline. She doesn't do that anymore. Explanations move on, metaphors wear out, but presence remains. Cleopatra's presence has outlasted usefulness, which is rare. Most historical figures are remembered because they're useful. They illustrate a point. They support an argument. Cleopatra doesn't need to support anything now. She's been relieved of duty, and relief is restful. Her name no longer carries tension, no warning label, no emotional charge, just recognition. Recognition without urgency. At this hour, urgency feels out of place anyway. Cleopatra's world moved quickly, decisions mattered immediately, outcomes were final. None of that energy survives here. It's been filtered out by time. All that remains is continuity. Cleopatra connects past to present without pulling either direction. She doesn't drag us backward, she doesn't push us forward. She just exists between, and between is a peaceful place. If this part feels like it's not adding anything new, that it's simply resting on ideas already expressed, that's because nothing new is required. The story has completed its work. Now it's just keeping shape. Cleopatra's story keeps its shape without pressure, without maintenance. That's how you know it's finished evolving. Not ended, finished evolving. There's no next phase, no next interpretation waiting just beyond the horizon, only repetition. And repetition, when it's gentle, is comforting. Cleopatra repeats herself quietly through time, not loudly, not insistently, just enough to remain. If your thoughts are slowing now, if even the idea of listening feels optional, that's perfect. The story doesn't need you anymore. It's learned how to exist without attention. Cleopatra doesn't fade when ignored. She doesn't sharpen when examined. She stays the same. And sameness at this depth is calm. This is where the story lives now. Unchanged, unmoving, unconcerned. A quiet constant in the background of everything else. Cleopatra remains. Not asking, not waiting, just there. As time finally stops checking in. All right, we're beyond echoes now. Beyond reverberation. Beyond that faint sense that something was said and is still bouncing around the room. This is quieter than that. Cleopatra exists here without sound. Not silence exactly, more like the absence of vibration. Nothing is bouncing back. Nothing is responding. The story has stopped calling out into the distance to see if anything answers, and nothing needs to. Cleopatra has become entirely self-contained. At this point, even memory feels optional. Not because she's forgotten, but because remembering doesn't change anything anymore. She's no longer in dialogue with the present. There was a time when Cleopatra was constantly being pulled forward, dragged into modern conversations, used as shorthand, invoked as comparison. Those uses have thinned out. Not vanished, just slowed. And slowing is important. When something slows enough, it stops interacting. It becomes background. Cleopatra has fully entered background mode. She's not foreground history. She's not even midground. She's atmosphere. You don't look at atmosphere. You breathe it without thinking. That's where Cleopatra lives now. She's part of the air of history. Unnoticed, unremarkable, completely essential to the shape of the space. And that's a strange kind of permanence. Not carved in stone, not written in bold letters, just present in the way the sky is present. No one asks whether the sky belongs. It just does. Cleopatra belongs like that now. She doesn't need defending against misinterpretation. She doesn't need correcting. Those conversations had their moment. They burned through energy. They resolved themselves into fatigue. Fatigue is honest. When people get tired of arguing about something, it usually means the thing has stabilized. Cleopatra stabilized a long time ago. What we're left with isn't debate. It isn't fascination. It's acceptance. Acceptance that her story doesn't need to be pinned down. Acceptance that ambiguity is part of the structure. And acceptance is restful. Cleopatra's ambiguity no longer frustrates. It soothes. You don't need her to be one thing. You don't need her to make sense. She doesn't owe coherence. She's already given everything she had to give. At this stage, Cleopatra doesn't even feel ancient. Ancient implies distance. She feels timeless. Timeless things don't move forward or backward. They don't age. They just remain. And remaining is easy. It requires no effort, no narration, no upkeep. So this part isn't telling you anything new. It's just sitting beside you quietly, like Cleopatra herself. There's no progression left, no arc to follow, just the sensation of something very old being completely unconcerned with whether you're paying attention. That's the deepest level of calm a story can reach, when it doesn't need you. Cleopatra doesn't need an audience anymore. She doesn't need witnesses. She exists whether or not she's being observed, which means you're free to let go. You don't have to carry her story forward. You don't have to remember the details. They're already held, somewhere deeper than active thought. So if this part feels especially flat, especially unmotivated, that's not emptiness. That's equilibrium. Cleopatra has reached equilibrium. No pull, no push, just balance. And balance is quiet. So quiet that even this narration feels unnecessary, which is exactly where long stories are meant to end up. Not with closure, not with meaning neatly tied up, but with a sense that everything is finally unbothered. All right, this is it. Not an ending in the traditional sense, just the point where the story stays behind and you don't. Cleopatra doesn't come with you past this part. Not because she disappears, not because she fades, but because she's finished traveling. She's reached the place where stories stop moving forward and stop echoing backward. A place that isn't silence, but isn't narration either. Cleopatra remains there, at rest, no longer interacting with time, no longer reacting to interpretation, just existing as something that has fully happened. That's the rarest state a historical figure can reach. Most never do. Most figures are stuck, being re-examined, repurposed, sharpened, dulled, argued over endlessly. They never get quiet. Cleopatra did, eventually. Her life was crowded. Her afterlife was louder. Only now, after centuries of noise, does she finally get the one thing she never had: space. Space without expectation. Space without symbolism. Just space. She doesn't need to represent femininity. She doesn't need to represent decadence. She doesn't need to represent the fall of anything. Those meanings wore themselves out. What's left is simpler. A person who lived inside impossible circumstances, who adapted as long as adaptation was possible, and who stopped when there was nothing left to adapt to. That's not dramatic. That's honest. And honesty at this hour is calming. Cleopatra's story doesn't resolve into wisdom. It doesn't crystallize into a takeaway. It just settles, like dust after movement stops. Nothing floating anymore, nothing being kicked back up, just stillness. If you try to reach for meaning here, your hand closes on air. And that's okay. Some stories aren't meant to be held at the end, they're meant to be set down. Cleopatra has been carried for a very long time by historians, by artists, by empires trying to explain themselves. She doesn't need to be carried anymore. So this is where we leave her. Not with a final thought, not with a summary, just with distance. The kind of distance that doesn't feel empty, it feels complete. Cleopatra remains exactly where she is, quiet, unmoved, unconcerned, and you're free to drift away. The story won't call after you. It won't remind you of itself. It doesn't need to. It's already where it belongs. So dim the lights a little more. Let the cadence fade. Let the words stop meaning anything specific. Cleopatra is finished asking to be remembered, and history, for once, has agreed to let her be. Good night.